Hello, everyone. Welcome to our meeting, the nice meeting of the Higher Purpose Forum. We really appreciate you being here with us, and we are looking forward to a very important meeting. This is our sixth meeting on the topic of the unity of science, spirituality, and religion, and tonight we have a very special, well-prepared presenter. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Higher Purpose Forum, which is an independent project of unificationism. We've been set up as a 501c3 in 2019. The other host of this evening's program is the HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership. And to welcome you and greet you, I'd like to introduce the dean, one of the deans of that school, Dean Stephen Boyd.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, as always. We're so grateful to be able to co-sponsor this program and others like it with the Higher Purpose Forum. We've had some very rich topics and rich discussion. Some very enlightening responses have come on these major topics, so we're really looking forward to this evening. And I also, too, want to welcome everyone to the program tonight. I'm here representing HJI, and as Dean of Enrollment Management, of course, we're happy to help anyone who might be interested in learning more about our courses of study. So at some point in the program, I'll be putting my contact information and some links to our degree programs and the application form for anybody who might be interested in studying a degree program here or even taking one course to find out what it's like, or if you wish to share with some of your friends and family if you feel they're interested also. So look for that later in the chat box. But for now, thank you very much for being here, and I'll turn it back to you, Jim.
Thank you. Can you see my screen there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, very good. Okay, so today's topic, our presenter is Alison Wakelin. Alison is on the teaching faculty in astronomy and physics at Widener University in Delaware, and her topic is Science Within the Consciousness of God, a very superficial, lightweight topic. And we're grateful to have back again with us this week as her respondent, Dr. Andrew Wilson. Dr. Wilson is a professor of scriptural studies at HJ International Graduate School, and we're so grateful to Dr. Wilson. This is the fourth time in this series that Dr. Wilson has been one of our speakers, and he's made a huge contribution to our effort to get into this very significant topic, and we thank him for being our respondent this evening. Our moderator tonight will be William Lay, who was last week's respondent, and I will help with moderating the chat. Here's a list of since last summer, of the 6 programs we've had on this topic of science, unity of science, spirituality, and religion. And you know, this is a topic that Unification has been committed to for decades. And Higher Purpose Forum with HJI is trying to make a contribution to the continuation of this important issue based upon the notion that spiritual and physical truth all come from the same source. So there is a unity and a harmony between the two areas of knowledge and understanding of science and religion. This is one of the areas in development by Higher Purpose Forum. We have one area which I would call worldview that I've been working on for the last 4 years, and the title of that content is Race and Providence in America. And we're always looking for opportunities to present that content. I presented it today, in fact, to a friend of mine. And we have 4 areas of counterproposal: building a racially integrated culture, justice and economic democracy. Today's topic, unity of science, spirituality, and religion. And this summer, we're introducing our 4th area, which is called, at this point, it's called the family and positive peace. And here's a brief look at our upcoming events. We have an event on June 6th on justice and economic democracy, and our main speaker will be Dr. Greeny, who's affiliated with the Center for Economic and Social Justice. He'll be talking about the Catholic concept of justice, and the respondent will be Dr. Walsh, who is actually the president of HJ International Graduate School. And then on June 18th, we have a continuing part 2 of a topic called Building God's Dream, Building a Racially Integrated Society. That's the second part of a presentation by Christine Edwards and Jeffrey Kingsley. And then on July 2nd, Dr. Ward will give our first talk in the series that we're titling The Family and Positive Peace. His title is The Pivotal Role of the Family in Realizing World Peace, and we do not yet have a respondent for that program. So at this point, I'm happy to turn the rest of the evening over to our moderator tonight, Bill Lay.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I'm delighted to be here and serve as moderator, and I'm really looking forward to our presentation and the response tonight. Everyone, we have terms of engagement you should be aware of. Please be aware that today's participants represent a range of faiths and perspective. Let's make sure that everyone feels welcome and included. I mean, this is particularly with regards to our discussion, which will come later. And we hope that you will join in verbally. What else do we have here for terms of engagement?
Sorry, yeah.
Our discussion period is an important part of this program. We encourage your participation. You can use the Zoom raise hand function so that I can call on you. And I mean, that is the best and most fun way to participate. You can also place your comment or question in the chat, where it will be handled by our chat moderator. The meeting is being recorded, and we will end no later than 8:30 p.m. this evening. Now, let me tell you a little more about our speakers today. Our presenter is Ms. Alison Wakelin, and she has a terrific CV, as you will see. Alison is on the teaching faculty in astronomy and physics at Widener University in Wilmington, Delaware. She taught astronomy and physics for 10 years on U.S. Army bases in Korea, and for a further 20 years in the U.S. She has an MA in astrophysics from Princeton University. She completed Part 3 of the Math Tripos from Cambridge University, and she has earned a Master's in Religious Education from the H.J. International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership. While in Korea, she presented her ideas at the Unification Thought Institute. Ms. Wakelin lives in Delaware and has 2 daughters. And we'll be hearing from her momentarily, but let me also tell you a little more about our respondent, who is familiar to many of you, Dr. Andrew Wilson. Dr. Wilson earned his PhD from Harvard University. His undergraduate degree, also from Harvard, is in biochemistry. Dr. Wilson joined the faculty of H.J. International Graduate School in 1985, where he is professor of scriptural studies and director of scriptural research. So I know we're excited to hear from Alison on this topic. So let me invite our presenter, Ms. Alison, to give us her presentation.
Thank you, Bill. Let's see if we can get this going. And slideshow. Okay. So I guess one thing I want you to know is that physicists over the last 100 years or so have really become sort of overwhelmed with awe and wonder about the universe. So it's not all that hard to talk to physicists about God these days. Many of them are not into theology, which is not a problem, but they still feel there's something more than, you know, the everyday stuff that we see. So some of what I've learned and I'm going to talk about has come from the Galileo Commission, which is like a group of scientists, maybe hundreds, maybe even 1,000 by now worldwide, who are interested in these more internal topics, and the Scientific and Medical Network. And some of it, of course, is from Unificationism. So anyway, let's see what we have to talk about. So I think the most important thing is to understand God's purpose in creating. And the first one, which I think most people would agree with, is to express and explore her own nature. This is not a difficult one to get across to many scientists. And then to grow and become. So that's a little challenging to more traditional religious people, but it's fine. And then maybe most of all, to create beings with whom God can share love and creativity. And also, I think it's important to state, to create a being, the whole universe, with whom God can share love and creativity. And so much of this is quite accepted, for instance, in the Galileo Commission. So because God wants to share deeply with her creation, then God's creations must exhibit freedom, responsibility, and creativity, which means that all creations must create themselves via their own free choices and decisions. And I know we usually think of this as the human realm, but I'm going to argue that the whole universe is busy doing the same thing. Okay? So we have to ask then, which came first, matter or mind? And throughout the 20th century, most people, well, many people considered mind to be an emanation from the ordered brain. And as a result of evolution, then the human brain, or I guess animal brain, but mostly the human brain emerged. And then the mind, or the sentient mind, comes from this brain. However, the alternative perspective is that mind gives rise to matter. And I think it's hard to argue that that's not true in God's case. God certainly started with mind and then created the universe to manifest his purpose. Okay, so now what's been happening in science? Well, let's have a look at that. So we have essentially a new paradigm. So before we go into the new paradigm, let's have a look at the old paradigm. I'm just going to run just a quick timeline to remind everybody roughly some of the most important points. So in 1687, Newton published the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, and this created a mechanistic universe. Everything is forces and inert matter in motion. We live in a machine. And so the mind is something outside of this, essentially. And many people still think like this, in fact. And then in 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which allowed us to understand evolution as happening without a necessity for a divine being involved. And then one of the most important things in physics was Maxwell's electromagnetism, which is a field theory. And that's important because that is what gave rise to Einstein's ideas and much of the 20th century physics. The quantum mechanics began in 1900. Einstein came up with his special relativity and his general relativity in 1905 and 1915. And then physics, quantum physics essentially came into being over a period of time, maybe mostly through the 20s and 30s. And then in the 50s, quantum field theories emerged. And in the 80s, scientists attempted to merge the quantum theory and relativity or gravitation, and essentially failed. And then in the 90s, string theory pretty much took over everything. So current topics in physics, however, are like really wide-ranging. What is time? Are there 2 or even 3 dimensions of time? What is real time or formal time? What's the difference? Is what Einstein was talking about the same as the time that we experience? Teleportation. Only atoms and molecules, and maybe not the Star Trek version yet, but people are working on it. And then are the laws of physics really unchanging, or have they been modified over time? Do we have a universe or a multiverse? Why is there so much fine-tuning? Why did huge spiral galaxies emerge so early in the universe? So you can see there's many, many questions now, which have gone way beyond what we started with. But we don't understand quantum physics, which was 100 years ago. We don't know what dark matter is, but it's required for our models. We don't know what dark energy is, what is causing the expansion of the universe to accelerate. Even the Hubble constant, which is a very important constant for galaxies, is bifurcating as it becomes more accurately measured. That's a big problem. And then also we come to the hard problem of consciousness. Why qualia at all? And Stephen Hawking's question, what puts the fire in the equations? It's all very well to have all this great math, but what makes it work? What turns it into a universe? And then, despite all the efforts of physicists over several decades, there is no model that unites relativity and quantum mechanics. So this is a big problem. It's the reason why we sort of have gone internal. We can't just think of the universe as a machine anymore. So the people sort of turn to a more philosophical approach in maybe the 80s and the 90s. And that's why we have all these philosophical questions coming up now. So it is motivated by what's actually happened in science. Okay, so remember that Einstein and many other people were looking for the theory of everything, the unified field theory. And the way they did this was to try to find that one equation that when you solved it, gave rise to everything else. The one equation that is at the bottom of everything. But he couldn't find it. Okay, so we have arrived at a point where we don't know what to do. String theory has essentially gone way over the top. There's like 10 to the power 500 possible models, but there's nothing to say which one is right. And we don't like that. So what's the problem? This. Okay.
A lot of men.
Yep. Yeah. I didn't make this up, but somewhere it has turned out that we think that the way that men think is sequential and logic based, right? Which is true. And that the way that women think is holistic and intuition based. So if you only have men involved, then you're missing out on a whole side of thinking. And that is what has happened. If there had been women involved in science in the early days, we wouldn't have had just a mechanistic universe. The James Clerk Maxwell's electromagnetism, a field theory, brought in a more holistic perspective. He basically said that everything is vibrations, which we agree with. We understand that now. So from our perspective, it's from the perspective of unificationism, we could understand this as being a lack of foundation within the Christian world that began and continued on the male basis. So there was no foundation for the emergence of a more feminine expression of truth, but basically this is gradually changing. Dr. Hak Jahan Moon is trying to correct the pervasive gender imbalance in the religious world, which is also affecting the scientific world. So at the beginning of the 20th century, things could have been very different. But as I said, there was no real foundation. But there were several people who sort of brought up challenges to what Einstein was saying, and also to quantum physics, such as Henri Bergson, Alfred North Whitehead, Teilhard de Chardin, William James, the Society for Psychical Research. So I'm not really going to talk about all of them, but there were many, like questions about how can there be no synchronicity? How can time be like Einstein says it is? And then we forgot them. We didn't bring them up for another 80 years or so. So for instance, quantum physics says that electrons, or any particle, don't exist as particles until you look at them. It's a little bit simplistic, but essentially that's what it's saying. So that doesn't make any sense, right, from traditional physics, the way that we think. But nobody understands this. So then all graduate students are told, shut up and calculate. It's usually attributed to Richard Feynman as starting that, but I think there were others too. So essentially then, quantum physics, we approached it in a very instrumentalist manner because we were more interested to be able to predict the outcome of experiments than to understand what's going on. There were a few people, obviously, such as Einstein and Bohr, who would sit up late at night and arguing about the meaning of quantum mechanics. Einstein really did not approve of quantum mechanics, even though he was one of the early people who came up with quantum ideas. So one big problem is that quantum mechanics and relativity are incompatible. Quantum physics is a probability-based science. It requires consciousness to project matter into an actual state. But relativity is a deterministic model, like Newtonian mechanics, where all reality is predetermined from the equations in the initial conditions. So if you have a deterministic model, it means that anything that you do makes no difference. Everything was already determined from the equations right from the beginning. So that really sort of does away with free will. And that was Newton's stance, and that is Einstein's stance in relativity, which people maybe don't always realize. And that is very different, of course, from quantum physics, where consciousness is necessary. So in general relativity, you have the idea that that we have a block universe. It's deterministic, and basically all of reality exists at once. In other words, I'm not creating what comes next. I'm not creating my life. I'm not making decisions. It's already there. Time is just an illusion. And Einstein believed this, and he argued for this. So basically, we experience the reality around us. We don't create it. And we can move in time by accelerating through space-time. But we're not affecting it. Okay, so this idea is a bit of a problem, and Einstein himself was actually a bit of a problem in this, because he very strongly argued for against quantum physics. Okay, so let's look at Kurt Gödel. So this is, in 1931, he published his incompleteness theorem. This is Gödel with Einstein. They were both at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton together, and they were best buddies, and they would walk home from the Institute every day together and talk to each other. So Gödel was associated with the positivists in Vienna. Now, the positivist agenda sort of is to turn everything into a proof as opposed to a truth. This is one way to sort of keep things on the logical level. So you start with the basic axioms, which are mathematical usually, and then you argue whatever you can derive from these is reality. There is no inner hidden reality beyond this. And they expected that Einstein would support this, because that's essentially Einstein's relativity started from there. He said the only reality is what you can measure. And he explained how to measure. Basically, you can measure things with clocks and light signals. But Einstein, basically, he's not one to be consistent. So he basically said, when he was asked about it later, he said, I may have said that, but it's nonsense, which I think is a great expression there. Anyway, the alternative is to search for truth through experiment with openness to the experiencing subject. So instead of just proving from a set of axioms, you actually interact with the real world, and you want to understand what's going on in the real world. So arguing from within the positivist agenda, then Kurt Gödel proved essentially this one. In any reasonable mathematical system, there will always be true statements that can't be proved. Therefore, there must be more than just a system of equations to describe reality. So he did away with the whole effort to come up with a mathematical description alone of reality. So what did they do with that? They ignored it, even though he'd totally proved it. And so it was ignored for decades until maybe the 90s or even like the early 2000s. Now people are realizing what he actually said because they're more willing to let go of the previous agenda because it's proved so difficult. Okay, so if you're interested, Roger Penrose used this theorem to argue, therefore, as well as mathematics and so on, there has to be something else. And he argued that something is consciousness. Now, at the same time, through the 20th century, Carl Jung has introduced the collective unconscious. He says, the collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. And we've become fairly comfortable with the collective unconscious. Most of us know roughly what that means. And basically, we also understand something about the archetype. So it means that when you look at something, there's something more, something deeper than just the external. So, for instance, the bird in flight reminds us that we can be above it all. Everything in nature expresses something within the consciousness of God. The rose expresses the beauty. So the archetypes in the psyche of God exist within the collective unconscious, God's consciousness, and are expressed through all of God's creation, from elementary particle to the human. So I'm now making a big step here to say that we exist within the psyche of God, and God expresses his and her nature in all things. And one of my favorite books is Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview. In this book, he talks about synchronicities, which are meaningful coincidental events. It's an event in both in the external world and in somebody's mind and consciousness, especially in like critical times in their lives, which appear to have a meaningful message to communicate. And these are very powerful if people feel they've had a real synchronicity. So in this same book, this is a really bad picture of a diagram, sorry. So this larger circle is the world, and the smaller circle is the self. And you probably can't really tell, but this is all shaded a deeper gray. Same thing over here. This is the world, and this is the self. But in this side, only the self is a deeper gray. So, according to the primal worldview, in the primal worldview, intelligence and soul, the shaded area, pervade all of nature and the cosmos, and a permeable human self directly participates in that larger matrix of meaning and purpose within which it is fully embedded. But in the modern worldview, all qualities associated with purposeful intelligence and soul are exclusively characteristic of the human subject, which is radically distinct from the objective non-human world. So, as most people tend to think, only the human gives meaning and intelligence and so on. Well, everything else is sort of a background against which the human acts, or too often leads to exploits. So the Native American perspective, of course, is very similar. Not only do they speak with rocks and trees, they are also able to converse with that which remains invisible to us, a world of what could be variously called spirits or powers or simply energies. This wider reality embraces flux, change, and transformation. Okay, we can learn from the stones, the eagles, the squirrel, deer, bear, the coyote, all of nature, but doing so requires that we respect nature. We may not consciously remember what was said when we converse with a stone, but we can respect its ancient wisdom. Even much of the world, the Buddhists and Hindus, to many people in the world, consciousness is primary and gives rise to the physical world, either as an illusion or as some kind of reality. So I just want to talk a little bit now about Alfred North Whitehead's process thought, because I think his is sort of, in a way, the closest to unification's idea. Remember that we think that everything has some kind of inherent directed nature, even a particle. So I want to just share a bit about how he sees the world. And he was writing at the same time as Einstein, actually. And so he was also a mathematician and essentially a physicist. So he came up with his own version of relativity because he didn't accept Einstein's. So in Einstein's version, his special theory of relativity is based on two principles: the constancy of the velocity of light in a vacuum, I guess in all inertial frames of reference, independent of the velocity of the emitting source, and then the independence of the laws of physics from the choice of the inertial system. But Whitehead's theory is based on two very different foundational principles, which are the appeal to direct experience and also recognition of the observable properties of relative motions between alternate time systems, which demands an awareness of simultaneity for its basis. Now, let me see if I can, let me go back, see if I can explain physics to you in just 1 minute. So the problem with Einstein's idea is there is no simultaneity. There's nothing outside of the universe. You can't go outside of the universe to the clock in God's office and tell the time, the universal time. There is no universal time in Einstein's theory. Everything is within the universe. So you can't say whether something is simultaneous or not. You can't even say that one thing causes another thing because maybe in a different frame, the other thing happened first. So, but Whitehead basically argues that no, the organism, the human, the organism, the particle is primary. The experience of the particle is primary. So therefore, we should be able to see if there is simultaneity. So in process theory, every particle consists of both a matter pole and a mental pole. A particle is more like a process or an event than a material object. And let me talk a bit, just a little bit about the prehension. You won't get it from this, but I'll read it. The prehension grasps everything that exists, which include all that has gone before, as information for the becoming of the next. Okay, so I'm going to explain prehension in a moment, but according to Dr. Matt Segal at the California Institute of Integral Studies, prehensions involve emotion, purpose, valuation, and causality. In other words, all of these things are part of what goes on with a particle: emotion, purpose, valuation, and causality. So let me just talk you through 5 stages. So the prehension for a particle, everything comes into existence based on what is around it, what has gone before, and so on. So you prehend everything that's already come into the beginning of your existence. But then you have a vision. What can I expect? What do I want? In the long term, where am I going? But then in the short term, what can I actually do here and now? Right. So I'm talking as though I'm a particle. Of course, they're not going through this in talking like this, but this is what is happening. And then there is a decision. or determination, you reach an agreement, and then you commit to it, you implement it, and in the process, you either repeat what has happened, or you repeat what was the previous incarnation, but with a slight, with creativity, including something that moves you on. So it's like evolution, but it's a very it's much more like the soul of Aristotle. Now, this means that every particle at every moment has to have some awareness of the whole universe, because the whole universe comes in as a prehension, right? So that doesn't make any sense. Einstein obviously says that's nonsense, because nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. In fact, he wrote a whole paper saying nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. Therefore, quantum mechanics is wrong. But unfortunately for Einstein, it was proved that actually, yes, there is quantum entanglement, which means whenever two particles are connected in some way, they will remain connected forever, unless they have a collision or something. So no matter how far apart they are. So actually, this idea of quantum entanglement much more supports Whitehead's view that the particle is connected with everything than it does support Einstein's view. And this was proved by Alain Aspect in the 1980s. And it's actually the foundation of many of the electronic gadgets that we use. Okay, so I've made a few arguments about some of the alternative viewpoints. I've tried to bring in the idea of consciousness as we know it. So let's just have a look at how we can understand that God created. So within God, everything is one. God is not Mrs. God and Mr. God, masculine and feminine. God is a unified being of masculinity and femininity, of positive and negative, of internal and external. But when you look at the universe, there has to be some sort of symmetry breaking for the universe to exist. Because otherwise you would have as much matter as antimatter. When matter and antimatter come into contact, they immediately annihilate and you're left with nothing. You might get lucky and get some light, but that's about all, essentially nothing. So in order to have any matter at all in the universe, then we have to have some sort of asymmetry in the basic laws. And there's just one little law that has a basic asymmetry, which appears to underpin the whole of the existence of the material universe. So in physics, mathematics plays the role of Aristotle's formal cause. So mathematical laws alone shape the cosmos, rather than Aristotle's soul. If there is a final cause, it's God's unchanging purpose, and it's not any of our business, if you're a physicist. But so the bottom line is, in the past, people have just assumed that mathematical laws govern the cosmos and govern everything, and create the shape of the cosmos. And when I say mathematical laws, I'm talking about, the law of gravitation and so on. But in Aristotle's soul, that's a much sort of a deeper thing. Every organism has an internal nature. So purpose and meaning exist within every created organism, and these essentially are the purpose and the meaning that were put into every creation by God. They are part of God's own purpose and meaning. So the purpose and meaning enter into the intrinsic nature of every organism, including elementary particles, via the universal prime energy. It could be prime force, I'm not sure. It's the same sort of thing. So this is more like Aristotle's forms than Plato's forms. In other words, these are immanent within the organism, rather than transcendent, just sort of within God, the transcendent God. And then in order to create, God has to create a realm of separation, which is unlike him or herself. But nothing outside of God exists. So God wants to create a realm of finite dimensionality. And rather than creating an outside emanation, then God creates within consciousness, within her own consciousness. The natural space expressing the nature of God would be a space of infinite dimensionality. So a finite realm, a realm of finite dimensionality, is both apart from and within God. And then fields and matter. Fields express, essentially, fields are the wave nature of reality, and a field expresses original oneness. A field extends throughout the whole universe. Like the gravitational field of the Earth never ends. It just keeps getting weaker and weaker as you get further away. So the wave nature expresses the original oneness within God, or the holistic part of God. But then the particle nature of reality expresses the individuality and the separateness, which is why you have to have both. They are together, they are an expression of the nature of God. The concept of the other, something different from me, gives rise to space. There has to be a space between particles. If you have a particle and another particle, you couldn't get that with fields, for instance. And then the concept of growth and development is what gives rise to time. We have obviously a lot of questions about time in physics. This is one of probably the most fiercely debated concept right now. What is time? Because in Einstein's ideas, time is just an illusion, and many people just assume that. Also, there's a variable called t in Einstein's equations, which people just accept as time, but then you get strange things like no, you can't say if something is simultaneous or not. And Einstein's time, the formal time, doesn't seem to relate to the psychological time, the time that we experience. So this is a very big debate right now. And then, so basically, I've sort of come up with the idea. I've just given you a few very little pointers towards the idea that the external form of God is the field of consciousness. When I say field of consciousness, that is representing consciousness as though it's a field. There are many, many different fields, different types of field. There is a matter field, right? An electron field in quantum field theory. Electron field is a field, and an electron can pop up if you observe it. So you don't have like a bunch of electrons running around. You have an electron field, and an electron is a specific representation of that field. And this is true for all matter. But then there is the idea also of a morphological field. A morphological field is a field that gives rise to shape. So rather than just using like gravity, for instance, to shape the universe. Maybe there is a field involved. Of course, in Einstein's ideas, then gravitation is a field. So that's okay. But I think that we also could look at morphological fields for the shape of organisms, for the shape of, why does DNA in one particular cell turn into a leg, and another one turn into an arm, and another one turn into an eye. So that sort of thing is a holistic action, which I think is much better explained using fields than trying to explain it with mathematics. Okay, well, I see that my time is coming to an end, and so I would like to stop here and hand over to Andrew.
Well, thank you, Professor Wakelin. That was a marvelous journey that you
Yes,
took us through. Historical in nature and introducing many thoughts and many terms. So again, I want to encourage everybody. We're going to hear from Dr. Wilson in a moment. I want to encourage everybody to try to formulate questions or comments to carry the discussion forward. But let's turn to Dr. Wilson, and let's initially hear his thoughts and commentary on Professor Wakelin's presentation.
Well, thank you, Professor Wakelin. That was great. And you certainly covered a lot of ground. I would like to be able to have a discussion on even one of those topics to go in more deeply. I mean, I'm really interested in any ways to kind of correlate some of these scientific ideas with some of the ideas in the principle, especially only one button. For example, principle usually thinks of matter in terms of particles, and particles have the virtue of being able to have freedom of action, especially Whitehead's particles that have internal nature and external form, so to speak, Sung-Sung and Young-Sung, and therefore you can talk like Richard Lewis does about how the collapse of the wave function is when the probabilities of an electron going this way or that way are in a two-slit experiment are resolved, and that by the electron making a choice whether to go to one side or the other. So particle gives you that kind of freedom, and it connects with divine principles like ideas like individual embodiments of truth. But waves and fields, this is something that hasn't really been well described in the principle. And I thought I heard you say that Einstein's theory of gravitational field is basically deterministic, that a field does not give you any opportunity for freedom or responsibility in terms of how things behave in a field. I don't know if that's helpful or not. It kind of turns me off on fields if that's all there is to fields, but I'm sure it's not. And the other thing about the divine principle is that it's always talking about give and take action. I would like to know what kind of scientific or mathematical form would correspond to or describe what the divine principle calls give and take action, because we can see from the lecture I gave a couple of weeks ago that electrical induction is the principle by which God creates, and essentially it's in physics term is producing a field around an antenna where the electrons are vibrating a certain frequency. You get a field emanating from that antenna at the same frequency, which is your radio signal. So if creation is like that, then could the field be the carrier for give and receive action? I'm curious about that topic. As far as consciousness goes, I really like your approach to see consciousness as primary. Father Moon often said that, mind precedes matter. And so these new developments in science that are looking at consciousness as the starting point rather than matter as the starting point. And certainly, if you're going to have a starting point for consciousness, this should be in the mind of God. So this is absolutely wonderful. And I think we can go a long way with that concept of the mind of God, because in divine principle we have the logos, and the logos begins in the mind of God before it's manifest in the physical world. And finally, I just like to, on the topic of synchronicities, I have had lots of synchronicities in my life. It usually involves God, and I've had at least a dozen experiences where synchronicity was a sign for me that this was God's action. And of course, if you look at the Bible and the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, most theories say there was some kind of synchronicity that took place, that the water of the sea just happened to be at a low point where there was either a tidal wave or a flood or something that allowed the Israelites to cross and the Egyptians not to. And so that was like a grand synchronicity arranged by God. So God had, and that's one of the things I was missing in your presentation, was how does God act in the world, which I think is really important. A lot of physics talks about, first causes or origins or starting points, but I believe that physics eventually has to be able to come up with an explanation for how God is interacting with all of these entities that she created. I'll stop here. I told Jim I would keep my remarks short, because I'm sure that a lot of people would like to discuss these different issues. So thank you for your presentation, Alison. Dr.
Thanks,
Wake.
Andrew.
It was wonderful. And I think we could have a whole class about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wilson. Professor Wakelin, would you like to take a moment or a few moments to respond a little bit to Dr. Wilson before we get into the full-blown discussion?
Well, there is one thing I'd like to talk about, which is give and take action. So okay, I had to draw it because I don't have a slide, obviously. So let's say here's an electron and a little k, whatever that is. That's two particles, right? So according to the model, it's pretty random whether these would work. I'm just choosing them at the top of my head. So according to the model of the interaction between these, what happens is the electron creates out of its own being a little particle called a pion. Okay. It then throws that pion over to the other particle. The other particle then absorbs this pion and then spits out another one and sends it back to the electron. And this is how particles relate to each other. This is what glues them together. And this is basically the quantum field theory model of forces between particles. So I think that is pretty obvious, give and take action.
Has a pion ever been observed? Or measured?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, all of these things are observed in, these collider experiments. These things are observed. And every force is mediated by something, like the electromagnetic force is mediated by a particle of light. And so that means it can act at very far distances, because light is very easy to throw around because it doesn't have any mass. What else did you ask? How does God act in the
So,
world?
so does that have anything to do with fields?
Yeah, that is a field. That's a description of a field.
So when we talk about giving and receiving of particles, whether they be photons or pions or gravitons, we
Yeah.
are also describing mathematically a field.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. How does God act in the world? I think in Whitehead's in process thinking, then the particle sort of brings in everything, but God exists to offer, like, what, it sort of sets up what could be the next step. And God offers, like, I think, eternal objects, so values, and the particle then makes the choice. So the particle itself can be creative by incorporating something new that is offered directly by God. Of course, God exists within the world as well. So God is actually evolving along with the world in process thinking. I don't think process thinking is exactly like ours, like the unification thinking, but I think it should be a part of it, definitely.
Yeah.
I think we need to merge the two.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, you're muted.
Sorry, Professor Wakelin. Did you just say that God is change? What did you just say?
I'm not sure which bit you're picking up on, but God is within the world. And so God offers, like, the next step towards God's purpose, but the particle or the organism has to choose. And in choosing what God offers, you can do more than just repeat what was in the past.
So you said that God is developing through this
Yes.
process himself.
Herself, yes.
Herself.
Him and herself.
Yeah. That's a very interesting.
And you would say that God is working through the internal part, the mental part of the
Yes.
particle.
Yeah.
To influence the particle's decisions, you might say. Or
To offer to the particle.
to offer opportunity for the particle to make a mental relationship.
Or to choose something higher than what
A mental prehension or something like that.
So, Alison, in Newtonian physics, that's an outrageous statement, right?
Yeah. Most of what I said today was outrageous.
It's completely outside, doesn't have any place in that model at all.
Well, yeah, because Descartes essentially separated out the mind and the physical universe. And so the mind has nothing to do with matter is totally inert, according to Newton.
Thanks all very much. I hope you'll be with us for our next session, and I thank you for opening the email that comes from Higher Purpose when it arrives. Let's give a round of applause to Alison.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you, Bill Lay. And thank you to Dean Boyd and HJI.